Okay, well, welcome to today's webinar. My name is Bridget and I'll be facilitating today's panel along with Loriana. Hi, Loriana.
Hi.
Before we start, I would like to acknowledge the traditional owners and custodians of the lands upon which we meet, recognising their continuing connection to land, waters and culture, and would like to pay my respects to elders past and present. I acknowledge the injustices committed against First Nations people and recognise that sovereignty was never ceded. This land always was and always will be Aboriginal land. I'd also like to recognise the unique role of Maori and embrace the Treaty of Waitangi, New Zealand's foundational document, which confirms Maori as the first people of Aotearoa. This recognises that they have absolute sovereignty over their lands, resources, and treasured possessions, while embracing the three guiding principles of the treaty: partnership, participation, and protection. And as women's organisations who've brought today's webinar to you, we would like to acknowledge women in all of their intersectional identities. We recognise a limitless range of gender identities and expression and embrace those of us who live beyond, against, or outside the binary. So, just a quick note about who we are for those of you that might be new here today. The Australasian Women in Emergencies Network is an organisation that promotes, supports, and recognises women in emergency management and disaster resilience. We work with our 2,500 members and their allies and friends to champion and empower them to realise their full potential and to drive collective action and change to create more inclusive opportunities for all. Gender and Disaster Australia is the national leader working at the intersection of gender and disaster. It provides evidence-based education, training and resources to address the harmful impacts of gendered expectations before, during and after disasters. So we're here today to discuss a new film called The Great Flood, and we've got an amazing cross-sector panel of people who we're going to ask to briefly reflect on the film, and then we'll then ask them a series of questions. Later on in the webinar, we'll open the floor to all of you who are attending to ask any questions of our panellists. So I'm very pleased to introduce and do a little wave as I introduce you. Firstly, Dr. Melanie Robson from the Australian Film, Television and Radio School. Dr. Cheryl Anderson from NEMA, New Zealand. Hyun Lee, a Korean-Australian writer and director. Shweta Dakin from GenWest. And Dr. Margaret Moreton from Gender and Disaster Australia. And I think what an extraordinary panel. It's going to be an absolutely fantastic discussion, a really unique and interesting range of women from across a whole range of different sectors. A little bit of housekeeping. The chat function is disabled in today's webinar, and that really is designed to enable a focus on the panellists and the discussions, but we do have the Q&A function open. If you'd like to submit a question, you can submit it, and if you'd like to vote for a question, you can do so by clicking the thumbs up icon in other people's questions. So we won't be answering questions in writing, but we will select the most popular questions to put toward panellists at the end of the session. We are about to see on your screen a quick poll. Please complete this as it will give our panellists a bit of a sense of who's in the audience today. You might be from emergency services, from the creative industries, from a community organisation. You might be a researcher from government or somewhere else. Please let us know. Thank you. And finally, we are recording today's session so that you can watch it again or share it with your friends and colleagues and networks as you see fit. I mean, as I said, it's going to be a really interesting session and well worth a rewatch. I'd like to now pass over to Loriana from Gender and Disaster Australia, who's going to talk a little bit about today's film that we're discussing, The Great Flood. Over to you, Loriana.
Oh, thanks so much, Bridget. And thanks so much to Or as well for participating in this webinar with us. It's so great. I'm so excited to talk about this film. I think we've got so much to talk about, and I'm really interested in all our panelists' points of view that they're going to provide today. But first, I'd like to just do a quick recap of the film, just so we're all on the same page. Just a quick warning to anyone that hasn't seen the film. If you don't want to hear spoilers, then maybe just turn down your sound for just 30 seconds to a minute whilst I'm going through the films, because it definitely does contain spoilers. So this film, The Great Flood, it's directed by Kim Byung-woo, who is a Korean director who directs films very similar to this in nature, adventure, disasters, sci-fi films that are really centered on character. And the character in this film today is Anna. She is a single mother, she's a scientist, and she's a survivor. And that's what we know about her from the beginning. And the whole film is really us following her journey as her apartment block, her rather large apartment block, is being inundated with water. And she's on one of the lower floors, and we follow her as she navigates with her son, Jae-in, as they navigate themselves towards safety. Along the way, we meet a cast of characters that each have their own journey and their own issues to deal with as the flood is coming through. One in particular is a security guard who you think is a savior and has all the answers, but that is a real red herring. And that red herring, once you realize that, the film really pivots on its axis and we notice the film becomes about Anna navigating herself through these levels again and again and again until kind of like a gamification, I guess, until she becomes the right mother to save herself, her son, and also humanity. So huge things, huge, big topics to talk about. Throughout this, that with this change, then the disaster definitely becomes the backdrop, and that is noted through various cues, such as the crystal clear water that she can dive into and find her son in, and the waves that have completely free of any debris at all. So there's all these cues that kind of so that you can understand that this disaster is cartoonish and really the backdrop to Anna's journey towards motherhood, I guess. And I think that's what this film is about. It's about motherhood and the journey to motherhood, but definitely from the male gaze. And that's why it's so interesting to talk about, right? And particularly on International Women's Day. There's nothing I could think about better to talk about. So let's dive into it. Dr. Melanie, as a film and television expert, what were your thoughts about the film?
Thanks, Loriana. When I first saw this film, I was thinking, I guess, about my experience watching Hollywood disaster movies because disaster films are predominantly and originally a Hollywood genre. So even though The Great Flood is not, it's clearly drawing on tropes and playing on expected narrative structures drawn from Hollywood and kind of recontextualizing them in Korea. Um, and one thing that disaster films tend to do is they mythologize the value of family. And so, in reflecting on the Great Flood, I was really interested in thinking about its representation of motherhood, as you kind of indicated. That's a really important theme, Loriana. Um, and there are many disaster films in which the mother is kind of burdened by family, for want of a better word. They have to make a choice between either saving the day or being a good mother. They kind of rarely can do both. Disaster narratives rarely allow them to do both. But interestingly, the Great Flood does almost the opposite in a kind of roundabout way. Anna's role of mother to Jae-in is portrayed as a burden, but a burden she's expected to disregard. She's expected to leave him behind. And the thing she's meant to actually value is her professional commitment, her scientific pursuits, which, at least the way the film frames it, is actually a different kind of motherhood. Her professional commitment is motherhood. It's to rebirth the human race, to become mother to everyone, to save the day. And there's not a lot of disaster movies that do this, but to me, it's really reminiscent of the film Children of Men, which is a film, I don't know if anyone's familiar, but it's a film in which all women have been infertile for 18 years, and then one pregnant woman emerges and she alone kind of carries the burden of fixing the human race. But where my knowledge is lacking a little is the film's is the Great Flood's cultural specificity. And I'm hoping that that's something we can discuss, this kind of motherhood metaphor further and the role motherhood plays maybe in real life disasters. I don't know enough about Korean culture to know what this representation in the Great Flood says about Korean values, other than I do understand this film has been tied to the crisis of falling birth rates in Korea. Anyway, that is my initial reaction to the film.
Wow, what a piece to jump off from. Thanks, thanks, Mel. I think we did have Dr. Cheryl to talk next, but she has been unable to. She's got some technical difficulties, so we
Here.
will. Oh, you're here. Sorry, I can't see you. Oh, there you are. Thank you. So, I'm
Yeah.
so sorry, Dr. Cheryl. I'm sure you've got a response to the film, but also to what Melanie was talking about. Please, I'm really interested to hear what you got to say.
Um, okay, so my reaction to the film, as you've already discussed, is that it is futuristic. It is looking at more the disaster as a backdrop and how survival plays out. But it is looking, and as you look at a big stressor, she's trying to escape from rising waters, and those are very similar to flooding and tsunami disasters. And so while it's building on these stressors, I thought that it resonated strongly with women's stories from experience as well. Looking at several tsunami, flooding, and tropical cyclone disaster experiences that I've had, the stories of women, of this woman trying to save her child as you go through the different iterations and different obstacles, is very similar to what stories that I've heard happening. So a story of a woman having her child ripped from her arms in a tsunami and being devastated. But then once the waters receded and she could have collapsed, but instead she goes around grabbing up the other children who seem to be without a parent and trying to help them find their community and their loved ones. And there are parts in this as we go through the story in the movie where she's searching for a child, but she stops to help with people, other children who've been separated and trying to find their community, a woman giving birth and trying to help her out. So the story as it evolves goes through several ways in which a woman's own experiences, the experiences of caretaker, sort of move her into helping to build and gather the idea of community as well as just being a mother. So that resonated for me.
Wonderful. Definitely. Really interesting, and I can't wait to kind of get into that a little bit more, particularly with your understandings of tsunamis and the way in which the roles in which women play, not just as mother, but also as saviors as well. I'd like to introduce our next panelist, Hyun Lee. As a Korean Australian writer and director, how did you respond to this film? What did you think?
I I was quite impacted by the confronting images of the disaster, even despite it being quite a Hollywood style disaster film, which at times got a bit cheesy. Like I pretty much cracked up once they started doing the gunfights. But it still got my heart racing, and I still literally had a bit of trouble sleeping that night because of the anxiety of, oh gosh, like what if that actually happened, and global warming is a thing, and where we have climate anxiety and so on. But I thought I'd like to respond to Melanie and how she was saying about the cultural nuances. I myself am a Korean Australian. I've grown up in Australia my whole life, so there's a few even more specific nuances that I probably would be missing myself in relation to Korean culture. So I'm not an expert, but I can say that I've heard that in Korea, that only until recently, with divorce cases, so single parents, custody is very commonly given to the father rather than the mother. And so I think the theme of maternal abandonment is a bit stronger over there. And also, the adoption rates in South Korea were quite high on an international scale. I think that's also dropped back a lot in recent times. But yeah, again, the theme of maternal abandonment and what it means to be a mother, I guess the cultural expectations are quite different, and that's definitely something to consider.
Excellent.
Yeah, I think I had lots of thoughts on the films, but I think I'd rather hear what Shweta has to say before I ramble on.
Thanks, Jan. We'll get into it later, I'm sure. Um, Shweta, as a worker in urban disasters, you must have had a particular response to this film when you watched it. I'm so interested to hear what you had to say.
There were so many layers of responses. One, as somebody who's worked in films, I come from the world of Bollywood. So, Melanie, when you spoke about the Hollywood trope, I was thinking of South Asian films and films from the tsunami experience in Sri Lanka and the earthquakes in Bombay and the earthquakes in Gujarat, and really how in South Asian films, it's never the Hollywood trope. It's actually, they speak about the collective nature of disaster, and then the gender roles become very embedded in the collective narrative. So that was one thing that really stayed with me, that distinction between how South Asian films represent disaster. The second thing that really stayed with me was yes, the film really explores motherhood, but there is this lens of nature versus nurture, because the child is, sorry, I'm going to give away the secret here, the child is synthetically created. So to me, it was about, okay, is nurture natural, or can nurturing be learned? Is motherhood considered, you need to be a natural mother to really be able to be, have those nurturing feelings? And on top of it, the entire future of humanity in the film depends on the capacity to be a mother, on the capacity to have this unconditional love. And that's what the ending is, right? When she becomes this epitome of unconditional love, humanity is saved. And for me, that's like, and what they also show is that there's this repetition of pain. The 20,000 levels she goes through of repetition of pain and sacrifice and proving herself and living with that guilt. So for me, it was like, okay, so maternal love is something you have to suffer through. And I really paused in that. I'm a mother of two children. I really don't want to be constantly told to be a good mother, you need to be self-sacrificing constantly. And that's what happens in disasters. I worked very closely with the community in Maryborough, 10 kilometers from Melbourne CBD, during a flood 3 years ago. And we saw similar expectations placed on women. Women are carrying the emotion and caregiving burden alongside all the other disaster repercussions they're living through. And it really reminded me of this, we spoke to women, and one woman said she feels she's failing in her role as a mother because her time is taken up with post-flood recovery. I feel hopeless. I feel I'm a bad mom. I'm not looking after my children. That whole thing of self-sacrificing mother, of, that's what really stayed with me. And in the end, I was like, the film really talks about how for humanity to survive, we need to be these nurturers, right? This emotion of unconditional love. But then it makes it about how much can women endure to have that unconditional love, instead of, what, maybe we should actually recognize and support and share the load mothers carry versus putting it all on them to be the self-sacrificing mother to save humanity. That's what I left with.
Amazing. Thanks, Shweta. I completely agree. And I'm interested to talk a little bit more about all the characters around that could have supported her, and the choice that that they all made not to. Like, they had their own things to do. It's such an interesting reflection of probably what does happen in a disaster. Now finally we have Dr. Margaret Moreton. Really interested in your response to the film, Margaret. As I understand, it was probably you have a very particular perspective on the film. I'd love to get into it. What do you think?
Thanks, Loriana, and I'm really glad I get the chance to speak after all of you. I found your perspective so interesting. So, Hyun, like you, I actually was bothered by this film. I was actually, um, you said it more gently. I was actually cranky. I was quite angry with the film. And it goes to what you were saying, Shweta. At the time, my children were approximately the age of the child in this film. I think I'm going to do some spoilers as well. I was a single mum. And I made a choice when my children were both born, I have a girl and a boy, to try to make sure I raised both of them to be tender and gentle and fierce and strong. That I wouldn't, I think there are differences. We could have a whole different conversation about gendered childhoods, but I think there are differences between the genders. But I wanted to teach my children to be both compassionate and empathetic and strong and determined. And I found some things about the film, I can feel it right now in my body. I found them offensive. So, just to end on a slightly stronger note than some of the other speakers who are probably politer than I am, I found it offensive that we defined motherhood in this film as a combination of empathy and sacrifice, because I think motherhood and humanity are so much more. I found it concerning that we were placing indeed the weight of the saving of the human race onto this woman when actually she wasn't saving the human race. The human race was going to be wiped out. What we were saving was a copy. That made me angry. And it made me angry about climate change and it made me angry about so many things. And I also thought, as soon as again, this is a spoiler, I apologize. As soon as I saw the first number that indicated that, yes, indeed, this was repetitive, and then I watched that number through all the subsequent scenes, then I felt that I was watching an abusive film. I felt really upset for her that she was repeatedly failing, failing, repeatedly. And I just thought, I thought we might have been in a video game. And then, of course, it reveals what we're actually doing. But I just felt angry that she was being abused in this way so many times, so many times. So I think I'll stop there because I think there are all sorts of caregiving roles and stereotypes that we might explore now. But yeah, I just wasn't comfortable with this film at all. Thank
Tell
you
us
for
how you really
nodding,
feel,
Shweta. I
Margaret.
love that you're nodding.
Thanks, Margaret. Yeah, tell us how you really feel. That's it's I think it's really important to note a lot of what you said, in particular the idea. I mean, certainly the idea in the last couple of years it's been about experimentation on women and what that means. There was, I think Kim just recently said that there was a report released last week about women and pain and the findings from that. Women's pain being ignored by medical and health professionals. And really, I think we can draw strong parallels with this film and those kind of findings as well. Yeah. Yeah, let's get into it. I think we've got some specific questions for each of our panelists. Yeah, I think Bridget, would you like to
Yeah, absolutely, I will. What a fascinating start to our discussion. As you've said, Loriana, there is so much to unpack here, and my mind is whirling, and I'm taking notes at a mad rate. But first of all, I'm going to ask a couple of questions of Dr. Melanie Robson. So, Mel, from a film theory perspective, what cinematic choices in The Great Flood, framing, pacing, and character work, how do they shape audience perceptions of gendered vulnerability and agency?
For me, the most, I'm going to use the word interesting, cinematic choices relating to kind of gendered vulnerability and agency are not actually to do with the visual aspects of the film. I mean, I'm sure we could sit here and kind of do a visual analysis of individual frames of the film, and it would be kind of an interesting exercise. But I I felt particularly sort of compelled here to speak about narrative. In other words, the way the story is told to us and the order in which the events are presented. Right at the beginning of the film, we're dropped right into the action. The water is already kind of coming into Anna's apartment, and we kind of hear the loudspeaker announcement as she's waking up. And we don't know if that loudspeaker announcement has been going for ages and she's just slept through it. But all we know is that as soon as the film starts, the disaster's already happening. And that's interesting because most disaster films actually have a long build-up prior to the disaster hitting, in which we get to know what the disaster is, we get to develop empathy for the characters, we get to know who is the expert who's going to save the day, who is the sort of antagonist. But The Great Flood doesn't do that. And that's interesting because the film is asking us to empathize with her situation before we know anything about her, before we even know what this disaster is. And therefore, we don't know what's at stake. We don't know that she's a scientist or her crucial role in the event. We don't know that her son is AI of sorts. That is all revealed to us gradually. And so our relationship to her changes as the film goes on, and then our understanding of the stakes change. And as those stakes change, so does our perception of her vulnerability. And actually, it doesn't give us a chance to see her agency, to see her abilities and what she's capable of until, I would say, the second half of the film when we go into the time loops. She's obviously a very accomplished scientist. She has a really crucial role in this event. And yet I feel like this is kind of downplayed at the beginning because of the way the film is structured, because we don't get that opportunity to get to know who she is at the beginning.
That's a fantastic answer, Melanie, and it sort of makes me think that they are presenting her as every woman, but sort of an anonymous every woman, if you like. And I agree, it's a really odd way to approach a movie, to just be launching into an event with absolutely no context. So as you say, you don't develop any kind of empathy or sympathy or recognition or rapport or anything with the character. You're just thrown into it as much as she is, I guess. Thank you for that fantastic answer. My next question is, how do disaster films historically construct heroism, and how might a more inclusive or feminist screen language reshape those kind of tropes?
Heroism is really key to disaster films. It's a major trope, a major sort of aspect of character development through disaster films. And what's interesting about heroism is that because films kind of tell us a lot about the values of the cultures that produce them, films kind of tell us who that culture perceives to be the hero and who is the kind of the vulnerable figure. And I guess to go back to Hollywood disaster movies, heroism tends to be constructed around individuality. We see this in one of what I think is one of the classic tropes of the Hollywood disaster movie, where the disaster is looming and authorities are starting to kind of herd people towards evacuation zones. And the protagonist, who's usually a male, decides to rebel against advice. They break away from the pack. They go against the advice to evacuate with their family in tow, and they head in the other direction, somehow managing to survive while everyone else, the masses, perish and get washed away by the flood. So individuality is often rewarded in disaster movies. The Day After Tomorrow, I think, is a great example of this. One of my favorite disaster movies. Jake Gyllenhaal's character continually makes individualistic decisions on behalf of his group that allow him to survive. And his father, coming to rescue him, is making an individual decision against all kind of logic, and against all odds manages to find him. I was watching yesterday a couple of clips from Deep Impact, to go back to the 90s for a moment, where something similar happens. Elijah Wood's character, right at the end through kind of individual fortitude and bypassing all kind of thousands of people sitting in cars trying to evacuate. He gets on his motorbike with his girlfriend and baby and drives up to the top of a mountain as the floodwaters are coming in. And one of the final moments of the film is him standing atop a mountain as the world is destroyed around him. I'm sure people in this group who've actually dealt with disasters probably don't advise this kind of rebellious behavior, but that's where kind of Hollywood and real life diverge. And I think we see that in Hollywood disaster movies because individualism is privileged in Hollywood cinema and, of course, in American culture more broadly. But to go back to your question about reshaping those tropes in terms of inclusivity and feminism, I don't think that the trope of the individual as hero is necessarily anti or non-feminist. The hero tends to be kind of male in a lot of disaster movies, but it doesn't have to be. But as Cheryl was talking about in her kind of initial reaction to the film, there are kind of alternative models of heroism, and we see this in The Great Flood through some of the examples she gave. Unlike the stereotype of the male hero in the disaster movies, we see incredible selflessness. In fact, in the time loops in the second half of the film, Anna's key to success is actually starting to move slower and stopping to help people. So she stops to help the woman give birth. She stops to help the little girl stuck in the lift get back to her grandparents. And she doesn't seem to have success until she does those things successfully. It seems like each of those diversions lead to her perfecting her run through of the building, eventually helping her find Ja-in. So I think that's a really kind of interesting model of heroism that we see in the film.
Yeah, what a fantastic answer, Melanie. And it makes me think of that kind of the notions of masculinity around protection and safety, and I think with the Hollywood movies very much, and they're often big, muscular men, really well built, and it's all, they're protecting their family or whether they're, the family's been separated, as is often the case. But what I love about this movie is that those notions of protection are expressed very differently, and I think that really helps us to think about what this notion of heroism means. Thank you so much, Mel, for answering those questions. I might throw back to you, Loriana.
Thanks, Bridget. Yeah, definitely. I mean, I couldn't go on or bang on enough about the ways in which heroism is presented in our media and what that looks like and the implications that has for gender, particularly in the work that we do in gender and disaster. Dr. Cheryl, what do you find in your work? I mean, what do you think needs to change in our systems, in our media, in our culture to ensure that women's experience shape how societies prepare for and recover from disaster?
It's an interesting question. I think that from practical experience and also resonating with this movie, we're looking at saving humanity sort of as the outcome through this futuristic lens. But it's all constructed as humanity is constructed by the male gaze. So it's what the men in society think is important in humanity for there to be. And I guess that goes to the systems that are constructed, the way that we construct a lot of our societies have institutional frameworks, and still there's not equality, and we are, and often those institutional barriers end up protecting these ideas that that women will not be able to succeed without men. Or so I thought that was a little bit interesting in the film, is that we're going to save humanity, but it's men's idea. But there is this little role for women, and it's that constructing what emotion is, or trying to figure that out. And that kind of plays down into when we look at disasters actually happening, they happen anywhere on what the everyday experience is. So it's a tsunami affecting an area, and people that are impacted, what are their everyday roles in that community, and who is more impacted by what they do on a daily basis in that society. So it could be a Pacific island, could be an island area where what people do is process fish and fisheries, and so they're in the way of the tsunami when it impacts, and you see more women impacted in that way. You see, so women not as the heroes, but as the people that suffer from the outcomes. Men as the fishers, there were, might be out in boats and able to survive the tsunami. So everyday lives play a role in how everyday lives are constructed, and the equalities or inequalities by what we do, the divisions of labor, by our socioeconomic status, whether we have access to capital or resources to be able to recover afterwards. And so with this movie, I guess that idea of how we're going to save or construct humanity, it's based on the idea that we can scientifically recreate all of this, but it's still constructed from a male point of view. So I think that trying to figure out how we do better with media and the portrayal in media, we could do better by having women construct some of the concepts of humanity that it is, not really reflective of how you're going to be able to recover, because what you're going to be able to recover depends on what you have before and how badly that's impacted.
Yeah, exactly. And that's so interesting. I mean, I guess that takes us to our second question, really kind of follows on from there. That if you brought disaster experts together and with artists, like how could you create a more accurate, empowering narrative for women? Like, what does that look like for you?
I think that would be a challenge in trying to figure out what a good society looks like that's going to be impacted, so that there would be, we would build on institutional roles. We would have more equality. The fact that the woman was a scientist was really interesting to learn from this movie, that she had knowledge and agency to provide, but that wasn't really taken into account from the beginning. And so I think acknowledging that there are women placed who have key roles in all of the areas of a disaster, that are disaster scientists, and that would have a good contribution to how you prepare, to warning systems that work, to the engagement of community and how communities would respond to the warning systems that would be in place. There are a lot of stories where, exercising the right way before a disaster really helps with the response, education, awareness building. But a lot of times you would need some women in the community who were advocating and who are agents and active, have gone out and been able to be very successful. I think that if we were going to have movies that took that into account, how women really have a lot of agency in their communities and a lot of roles, that could be better utilized in developing early warning systems and warning systems with the community members, then you would have better responses and maybe, hopefully, better recoveries.
Absolutely. Thanks, Cheryl. Bridget, I'll pass back over to you.
Thanks, Loriana. Just a reminder to pop your questions in the Q&A. We've got some great questions there already, but please don't be shy. So, Hyun, you're a writer and director. How do you think storytellers can responsibly depict women's trauma without exploiting it?
I think it's a really simple sort of approach, which is to just have more female writers and directors. I think it's definitely important context to note that the writer and director of this film was a man. And it's also good to know that in South Korea, they don't have the best track record with feminism, though there is a feminist movement, historically not a great track record. So that's the context in which this film was made. And yeah, it is very much coming from a male gaze, which I think, to give the filmmaker credit, I think there's a moment early on in the film where the mother is panicking about her kid needing to go to the toilet, which was for me like a surprising, oh, like they actually cared about the reality of what it is to be a mother in those sorts of situations. Like her kid needs to go to the toilet, and that's something she needs to think about. But then that sort of just goes down the drain for the rest of the film. And after that, it's sort of like movie land, where we sort of accept that she's not ever tired of picking up her kid and carrying her kid around and things like that. I think another sort of important way to have more realistic and significant sort of contributions in the space is to have discussions like this one, which are interdisciplinary and engage artists with professionals in the disaster sector. I think this is really cool and interesting for me because it's the first thing I've ever done that has tried to bring those very disparate worlds together. I hope that we can see more disaster movies made by women and more disaster movies made by women who have engaged with the sector, and it's not just this sort of thought experiment in a sci-fi fantasy that doesn't actually exist. I don't think I actually got around to answering the question though about the trauma element of exploiting trauma. I think it's a sort of perhaps lazy script writing device where trauma is just used to push plots forward. And I think, again, that can be really avoided so simply if we have women writers and directors who value their trauma in a very different way and would not exploit that trauma just to push a plot forward simply from the lived experience. I think is a big thing. It's already a huge discussion in filmmaking spaces about representation and having stories be told by the people who have the lived experience, or at the very least have really significant consultation with the cultural groups or communities that are involved. And I think it's a difficult process, even with in Australian filmmaking, with government agencies like Screen Australia. If you are making films about cultural minorities, the key creatives in those projects have to be from those cultural minorities. And as much as they can push for that, there will always be projects that slip through the cracks. So I think it's a slow, but I feel optimistic about the future.
That's fantastic, fantastic, Hyun. And it makes me think that our sector is starting to embrace that notion of lived experience and really recognising the value of that lived experience in terms of informing what we do as a sector to support communities before, during, and after emergencies and disasters. My next question is from your perspective as a filmmaker. What do you think disaster storytelling can contribute to real world conversations about preparedness, about resilience, about community responsibility?
I think for this question, I'd like to think about filmmaking in almost a philosophical way, in a much broader sense of what does film contribute culturally to the people who watch them, because I think we often just think of films as entertainment, but I like to sort of lump film in with a greater sort of cultural bracket of storytelling, which I think is so important for human understanding of where we are in this absurd planet. And I think about how children role play and make believe they pretend to be doctors, or they role play, and it's an important sort of developmental milestone for them to be able to do that. And I think adults watch movies instead of role playing. I think movies have a sort of very important cognitive sort of sorry, I'm jumbling my words a bit, but what I'm trying to say is that movies are culturally important for people to sort of process imagined scenarios, for it to be an imagined rehearsal space. And I think disaster movies have so much potential, and it can often be a really missed opportunity when we see disaster movies that show characters doing the wrong thing, but then in the film it's a celebrated thing. We see the heroes acting in quite reckless, individualistic ways, and I think films have the power to influence the way that people behave in those real life scenarios. And if we are able to make films that do this responsibly, and I do think filmmakers should have a sense of like responsibility with their work, because I do think films have that power. Yeah.
Well, they certainly do have that power. We're all today here having this fantastic discussion about just one movie, and that's a great example of what you've just been saying, Hyun. Thank you so much for your answers. Back to you, Loriana.
Oh, thanks, Bridget. Yeah, definitely. There's lots to think about here, from what you're saying, and I think to tie that in with Shweta's question about multicultural urban settings and what are the unique resilience challenges that films rarely portray, but that emergency management must plan for, so that we need to see, that we need to, as you were saying, Hyun, like we need to practice for and to understand.
Thanks, Loriana. And I actually was fascinated by Hyun's thing about, films positionality in our culture. So for us, especially people from migrant backgrounds, films are not just a mirror of society we're living in now, but they're also touch points to the culture and society of our homeland. We constantly live in two worlds. So while we're looking at society where we are currently, we're always in touch with society and culture back home. And film is that conduit. It maintains our relationship with what's happening back home. How is it changing? Because the film reflects how our society back home is changing versus also what's happening here. So for me, film is so much more than just entertainment, as Hyun said. But when we look at disaster films, and wherever in the world they might be from, whether it's Hollywood or, Bollywood or Korea, what I feel really lacks is that we very rarely capture how complex urban settings are, how socially complex urban settings are, from, in terms of the layers and nuances that exist in big urban cities. And especially in a place like Melbourne, which is so highly multicultural, it's not, one culture, it's not uniform. People experience disasters very differently in urban settings in a country like, and a city like Melbourne. It's not homogeneous. We have so many nuances of language, migration history, economic status, housing status, and also very complex relationships with institutions. There is mistrust in government. There's a lot of nuances and complexities in multicultural urban settings. And when it comes to communities' resilience, a resilient community is a connected community. What we don't realize and we don't embed in our emergency management is that in a multicultural community, people rely on networks. They rely on their community leaders, their faith leaders, their neighbors, and their family connections. They don't always rely on systems. So when you're trying to build the resilience of a community in the face of a disaster, that's what we miss. We miss the fact that women are the most important connectors in these networks. They are the ones who are spreading the information on WhatsApp or Telegram, and they are the ones who are checking in on their neighbors. That's the biggest network available, which we miss in our entire conduit of planning for emergency. We don't recognize those networks. We don't engage with those networks. They are an afterthought. I saw it during COVID. I saw it during the Maribyrnong floods. And until we really bring community and women as participants throughout the process, we're not going to really be able to address the challenges.
That's so interesting, Shweta. So how do you think that we can collaborate and get together to support this women's leadership in our community?
See, again, I will take away the word support. It's about working with. It's not about supporting them. It's about a strengths-based approach, work with the network. One of the models we've always worked with is, instead of being extractive, be inclusive, tap into the network, hire people from the network, give them jobs, involve them in the planning instead of just extracting information from them. That top-down approach needs to be dismantled. I call it the decolonized approach. It needs to be collective. It needs to be, not just supporting, but actually giving them resources, giving them paid occupations, and really working with them throughout the cycle of preparing and planning for a disaster and after a disaster. When you work in that cyclical manner with grassroots networks, with women, I have examples of that when we worked in Maribyrnong. The two women community leaders who were the absolute pillars were just two Vietnamese women who've been working in the community for the last 4 years, never recognized for their work, never paid a single penny for their work. And that's what we want to challenge. Make them contributors, not somebody we extract from. So I think that's how community leadership can be supported structurally, embedded in the structure from day one, not as an afterthought. And recognize their strength, pay them for their work.
Yeah.
Not
And
just extract.
when we do that kind of thing, that's how you build faith, right? Where you talk about there's a distrust in government and government-like organizations. When you're working
Look at
with
the
them.
history of people from migration and refugee backgrounds. The trauma you carry from a war-torn country, and you've come into a country where, I'm going to be very blunt, but the majority of people in power are very similar to the people who oppressed you.
Yeah.
Right? How do you trust them? You do a town hall, and there are these 5 people standing there in uniforms who are telling you about how to manage a disaster, but you can't trust them because they look like the people who have oppressed you historically. So unless you have representation of people who look like you, who think like you, who are from your culture, who can understand your experience of displacement, dispossession, colonization, how do you expect them to trust you?
Absolutely. Yeah, wonderful points. Thanks, Sage Shweta. Bridget, back to you.
Thank you so much. What an absolutely amazing conversation. Margaret, the film depicts Anna juggling survival and caregiving. How does this reflect real women's double burden during disasters?
Extremely accurately. So I'm tempted to engage with Shweta on her final remarks just then, but extremely accurately. I can hear women in my imagination, real women who many of us have met and know, who are leaders in their community and are very strongly part of the recovery process after an event like a flood or a fire. I can hear them all saying, "Oh, Margaret, say something about us." Absolutely. The traumas of trying to choose between your familial responsibility or your motherhood and the good, well-being of the community, these are very real. The load that women carry trying to do their actual paid work in many cases, looking after their children or partner or whoever is in their life who has also experienced the similar trauma through the event. And then also trying to work out how to carry the whole community forward. This idea that Anna is carrying humanity. Absolutely, women in communities all around this country feel this for decades after an event. And we just have to think about Lismore, where they have repeated floods. And those women have been carrying this load for a decade or more, heavy load, not tapering off, not, you know, a lighter load in between. No, endless, repeated. I think that's why the film triggered me a bit. It's endless, repeated damage. And while nobody makes the Lismore flood occur, I feel a frustration on behalf of the women who are carrying this load because as I was listening to everybody else, I was thinking the women carry the social capital, the connections, the relationships in their communities at the best of times. They run things at schools, they connect each other. So even if it's nothing to do with disaster, women at the best of times are carrying this work, neighbourhood connections, neighbourhood houses, community houses, and so on. Add disaster to that, and the load is extremely heavy, and we don't fund or support that work nearly well enough after an event, and neither do we. Some of you will know, some of the people listening will know of things like simulations and exercises where we prepare for disaster. What we're really preparing for is the emergency response. And almost everybody in the room has a uniform or a suit or a tie. What we're really doing is focusing on that part of the event. Very rarely, I'd love someone to sing out and tell me during the webinar or later on if you're aware of recovery simulations. We're currently involved in our work in helping people prepare more effectively for evacuation and taking on board how to make women and children, migrants and refugees, First Nation people, people with disability, all of the intersections that we all deal with, more comfortable and have a stronger sense of safety in an evacuation centre. But it's rare. It's rare to be preparing for relief recovery and planning and funding it. We were all trying our best to do these pieces of work, this very important work on shoestrings. So we need a system shift to think of and value this work as highly as we value the very important work that people on fire trucks and with hoses and, on boats do. I'm in no way saying that's not important work, but we need to balance the scales. I've just come out of a few days of International Women's Day discussions where the theme this year is rebalancing the scales. We certainly need to do that. I actually, like I think Hyun, I have actually forgotten your question, Bridget. Did I answer your question?
You did answer my question. Thank you,
Excellent.
Margaret. And I think what you're saying really goes back to the storytelling, and we don't actually hear the stories of the things that you've just described, Margaret. We don't hear stories about social connection, social capital, social cohesion, what makes a community strong in the face of adversity. We certainly don't see movies about disaster recovery. Who's rebuilding lives and homes and families. That's, as you say, Margaret, is decades of work often. And it's a really, really tough slog. And it's not sexy. It's not lights and sirens. It's not great big floods and flames going up trees like you see in movies. And so movies really do, or film really does focus on the response itself. And that's largely where a lot of the funding goes to, for those of you not familiar with our sector.
Yeah.
So thank you, Margaret. Just one second question for you. Anna endures repeated trauma within the film simulation. How do disasters disproportionately impact women's psychological burden and emotional labour in real life?
Absolutely, they do. And there's all sorts of, I'm going to do a plug. Imagine that. I'm going to do a plug. All sorts of fact sheets and data that you can get from our website and from other places. So women's lives are placed at risk because of their gender and the roles that they take. during disasters, usually with caregiving as the focus. A moment in the film, I actually have to tell you one moment in the film that I liked. I apologize. The caring older person who's looking after their disadvantaged and disabled partner is a man. Yay, a little tiny moment of a man caring for a woman. Excellent. I just like that little moment. Doesn't save him, but anyway. Yes, so we are affected. We're more likely to die. We're more likely to lose our employment because, of course, I'm going to race through these because, of course, after a disaster hits, if someone has to look after dependents or sort of the family or manage the process of insurance, and it's likely to be the woman who will stop working and the husband or partner, if it's a male binary couple, will work. So, these caring responsibilities and the trauma and the emotional load. I interviewed a man who will stay with me in my mind forever when I did my original research, where 4 years after the event, he did want to be a part of the study, and his wife arranged the lot. So she arranged the time, the place. She made the scones. We had scones, delicious country people make great scones. And then she took the dog for a walk down there, out through the paddock. And I sat on the veranda with this man who she had been carrying the emotion of this household, let alone her other roles in the community, for 4 years, because for the first time ever, he shed a tear. And he shed it with a stranger with grey hair, comfortable. I was going to leave. He'd never see me again. And he shed it with me and then said, perhaps I should actually share this with her. And she'd been through everything looking after this man's emotional state. There are so many other ways that I could answer that question, Bridget, but I'm very conscious of the time. So, yes. And if I were a man, I wouldn't like this film that much either, to be frank, because the men are completely expendable. And he takes a long time, the soldier guy, the rescuer, he takes a long time to work out what's going on and then actually try to work out if he can help. Anyway, that's a whole other topic. Thanks, Bridget.
Thank you so much, Margaret, and thank you to all our panelists for answering those questions. We're going to move on to our Q&A session now, and I'm going to throw back to Loriana to take us through that. Thanks, Loriana.
Yeah, definitely. Well, I'll start asking some questions from the Q&A at the side. I'll start with the most popular. So if you haven't voted, have a look at the questions and have a vote. But I'll start with Jamie McLaughlin's question. To all the panelists, if you were to create a feminist disaster film, what would it be about, and how would you make it a feminist film? For example, which disaster would you showcase and how would you portray women's roles in emergencies? So maybe we'll go to Hyun Lee first, just to as a film producer. But yeah, I'm very interested in all of your responses to this.
Yeah, what a cool question. I don't know if I can think of a disaster movie on the spot, but if I were to make a flood movie like this one, maybe with a similar plot, I would probably show the mother being a scientist in a meaningful way. Not to be too critical of the film, but it is interesting that she is represented as such an every woman from the very start, which might be a quick way for the audience to be able to relate to her, because it could be you. If she's just relatable. But I wish that we saw her being a scientist for real, because we don't ever see her doing her job in any kind of way. Yeah, I think I would also shift the themes of this film, so that rather than messaging that this sort of binary where men are these stoic, practical, rocks that that get things done, whereas women are the emotions, and that's what they're good for. I think I would show women as being good for more than just their emotions, because that's the truth. And yeah, I think this whole conversation reminded me of a speech that Reese Witherspoon gave in
Yeah.
some kind of award presentation where she was talking about her frustrations with every script that she'd ever been given. So often there will be a conflict on screen, and there'll be some kind of disaster where the characters have to figure out what to do next. And the woman always turns to the male lead and goes, "What do we do now?" And she was so angry, being like, no woman ever has ever said that in that situation. No woman would turn to a man and be like, tell me what to do. So I think this film, to give it some credit, doesn't do that entirely, but I do wish the protagonist had a bit more agency in what she does in life.
Excellent. Thanks, Hyun. Does anyone else want to take this question on?
I'll take it on. I love this. Sorry, there are other hands up, but I'm just jumping in. I mean, a lot of people spoke about it. I know Melanie spoke about it. Dr. Cheryl spoke about this whole Hollywood trope of very individual way of dealing with disaster. There's always a hero. But I've seen a lot of cinema from South Asia, as I mentioned, after the Sri Lankan tsunami, after the Bombay floods, where the disaster is the backdrop for emotional situations, where it's all about the resilience of the community coming together. That's actually what happens in real life with disasters, right? And I would love to see that being portrayed in a very typical Western scenario. Bring the collective wisdom of the community, how they actually respond after a disaster. Give the agency to the community. Show what really happens. Show how women actually are the leaders. The women are the ones who are carrying this entire thing. And let's see those stories and not just an individual heroic narrative.
Love it. Thanks, Shweta. Margaret?
I agree, Shweta. And I would say I have two granddaughters. So, hello world, I have two granddaughters. And I want them to see all sorts of possibilities that they can be when they grow up. So, like all the other young girls in the world, I want them to see that they can do whatever they are attracted to do. And likewise for little boys, I want them to see that it's okay to do a range of things. So I did like the moment that the man was looking after his partner. So what I'd like to see is a disaster movie. I don't mind. So this is a shout out to all women directors. I want a woman to direct a movie like this. I don't mind if it's a fire or a flood or some sci-fi event or a meteor. I don't really care what it is. But I want to see men and women planning for this event and listening to each other. I want people listening to each other as equals as this event unfolds and they try to work out what they're going to do about it. And then when the heroes go out to try and blow up the meteor to save the earth or do whatever, I want men and women both. I want someone who's LGBTIQA+. I want the team to work as equals. No one's ever going to make a movie like this, but I want the team to work as equals to try that first thing. And then we all know in movies that the first thing fails and then the second thing has to be tried and then it's the final thing that three people die doing that saves the world. I want men and women both to be in each of those stages. And then when we're rebuilding later, I want women to be making decisions and leading teams, and I want women to be doing some of the things we already do, but I also want men to be doing, and I want them listening, the visuals that say, we all contribute here. I want to see First Nations. So massively diverse, equal people solving the problem together, thinking it through together, taking actions together. That's what I want. Not in my lifetime. Oh, I do want it in my lifetime. Unlike
I want to see that film though. That's exciting. Let's do it together. Let's make it a Gender and Disaster Australia project.
And we could do that. And in order to attract people to see it, we clearly have to have, the Ryan Goslings of the world or Margot Robbie, or we have to have the big names who do it. But we could probably pitch that.
Yeah, we'll get Greta Gerwig to direct it. It'll be great. Melanie, what do you have to say?
Well, I just want Margaret's film to be made now. But what I was going to say is I don't think we see enough disaster movies where women are assumed to have leadership qualities. As soon as disaster hits, it's always the man that is assumed to be the leader, and a woman will only be given that leadership position if she possesses particular qualities. And we see it in the Great Flood. I don't think Anna would be called upon to save humanity unless she had the specific qualities and she'd been involved in this scientific project leading up to that. So I would like to see a disaster movie where a woman is assumed to be able to be a leader just because she's a person, or maybe she can just take the lead, rather than everyone assuming a man is going to take the lead.
Yeah, I agree. I think about films like that we did last year, which was Twister and Twisters, the sequel, and that both had a female lead, but she was a particular type of lead that had specific knowledge in both those cases. So yeah, I agree. Like, should we go to another question, unless anyone else wants to add to that? No? Excellent. I think I've got one from Mary here, which I think speaks to a little bit of what people were talking to in our initial responses and our questions. I'm also interested in the male hero in this film. As someone who is learning about love and empathy as he goes, based on the model of the woman, and he also realizes he is seen as expendable in the great scientific experiment. Perhaps until he also learns how to be a good parent through the levels? Question mark. The people's side of disaster is often forgotten in planning. So although I agree this film puts far too much burden on women, it also looks at what drives people to survive through collaboration. So it speaks a little bit to what we were talking about before, but does anyone have a response to that at all? We're all thinking. No? All right. Well,
Could
we'll
we
go.
recap what the question was in maybe
It's
a
really
sentence?
a commentary about the man in the film, the male hero in this film, and his self-sacrifice, and his learning about love and empathy throughout that. But maybe things could have been better if they had have actually worked together and collaborated. And I was just wondering what your response was to that, and what your thoughts were on the idea of collaboration and what drives people to survive.
I might just put myself forward to say something here. I think with this movie and with a lot of movies, and particularly science fiction movies, women are represented as having this mysterious quality. You know, we have these instincts, we have this love, we have these intangible things that men apparently can't seem to get their heads around. And it is presented like that. If I think about the film Arrival with Amy, what's her name? You know, and she had this mysterious ability to be able to communicate with the aliens. If we think about this movie and this mysterious thing that this woman possesses, that's called love, and you know, and I wonder about how, you know, men and women are represented on screen, and both in the emergency management sector, where men are certainly expected to be very in control in their uniforms, command and control. God, you know, emotion is not considered to be a necessary part of emergency management. But in actual fact, all of us know that empathy, that kindness, that courage, that compassion are actually key to effective emergency management. So just a few thoughts from me. Thanks, Loriana.
Yeah, I mean, I did some research looking at some kind of Reddit responses, so community responses to the film, and it was so interesting. One of the responses that got the most votes and people agreed with definitely was they really wanted that male character to be the son. And I just thought that was so interesting that he couldn't exist on his own. He had to have a connection to her in order to do the things, the sacrificing on I just find that that's such an interesting take on males and how they might respond during disasters. But yeah, anyway. Margaret.
This could really take us down a rabbit burrow that we don't need to go down, but I do find it interesting that that notion of the emotional important work for both the male character and the female character is this sacrifice. So I'm sure we've all sacrificed for the people we love, and for anyone who's a mother, you kind of do that in lots of small ways all the time because you need to put the needs of somebody else ahead of yourself. But I do find it interesting that the whole movie seems to be predicated on this notion that a very important element of humanity, of love, is sacrifice. And I wonder what would happen if a movie was, if we had a conversation about what love is. I promise I haven't had a glass of wine. It's way too early in the day. But what is humanity and what is love? And it's so much more than sacrifice, although I do acknowledge that there is sacrifice involved. You know, is it Deep Impact where the huge wall of water eventually, yeah. Because I loved your references earlier to all those movies. I looked up Poseidon Adventure while someone was talking because I wanted to be able to name the actress Shelley Winters. Now, for all of you who are younger than me, the Poseidon Adventure film was in 1972, and a ship turns upside down and they all have to get to the hull of the ship, which is above the water, in order to live. And Shelley Winters' character sacrifices herself. She dies deliberately and intentionally in order to free somebody else, I think a man. So it's this whole question of sacrifice. I do completely accept sacrifice, but it's interesting to explore the ideas of what is humanity, what is love, you know, what is collaboration. When he does get it, this guy, he does try to help her. He's always been confused about it. He can't quite remember the previous times they did it, but he knows something's going on. But he does then try to help her achieve the goal. So, you know, all is not lost. Anyway, I'll stop.
I think it's interesting what you say about sacrifice, Margaret, because if you ask me what motherhood is about the endless monotony day in, day out. And maybe that is sacrifice as well, but it's also the willing to experience that day to day with your child, particularly when they're young.
Agreed. And
Yeah.
there's great joy that comes. So
Yes.
there are many aspects of this.
Yes.
It's not so much a simplistic view of empathy
Yeah.
and sacrifice equals, you know, motherhood. There are
Agree.
many, many complex aspects that make it all worthwhile. But anyway, over to Shweta.
Shweta, you've got something to add?
Just fascinating because in the film, the male protagonist immediately sets the frame as abandonment issues. He was abandoned by his mother, and this woman becomes the absolute signifier of please don't abandon your child. That's the relationship between them. And when he realizes that she is not going to abandon the child and that she is going to go back to the child and save the child is where the relationship turns. So classic male abandonment issues have been the premise of this male character throughout the film. And the woman redeems herself by not abandoning, because the way he speaks about the other boss, right? And, you know, the way he speaks about his own abandonment issues, classic male abandonment issues with mothers.
Yes. Absolutely. Cheryl.
I just also thought that in relation to this question and what I think what Margaret just said, that it's the everyday part where you build the resilience. So you were also saying it's the work that you're doing every day. It may not be sacrifice, but there is an everyday survival element, but that's where you build resilience. And so it's the skills that you have, that you've developed in practically what you're doing every day, that can be built on to respond to disasters. And I think we sometimes forget that.
I think that takes us really nicely into this next question, Cheryl. And I'm interested in your response to it. How much of an impact do you think disaster movies have on people's perceptions of real life disasters? Is this harmless fiction or potentially dangerous? For example, the narrative rewarding of the individualistic heroism previously discussed by Hyun.
I think that there are that it's really important to have the role models, like Hyun was saying earlier, to be able to see the heroism. Then you can think about becoming those heroes. So having good role models in society, I think that's really important. I think how we construct it sometimes it can be advantageous or problematic. So care should be taken in that area as well. So I think that what Hyun was saying earlier, I think, and Melanie has also raised it, that is really important to be able to see in the disaster movies that women being role models and heroines is really positive.
Thanks. Thanks, thanks, Cheryl. Margaret.
I so agree with that. It is really important for people to see positive contributions that all genders can make, for example. But I was also going to say, I'm worried that in both movies and social media, and particularly with the advent of AI, there's quite a lot of unrealistic and dangerous behaviors that people see in films undertaken by heroes who then survive. So I worry that people will make poor choices and already do. I worry that we circulate the movies of people protecting their home when, frankly, they should have left ages ago. I worry about everything, all the images we show that, and particularly in a movie which is not real, when the key characters make it through and it's okay, they've survived. I've become a little bit dark in that sometimes when there are disaster movies or action movies, you know, if there's a team of people solving the problem, probably two of them are going to die on the way through the movie, and the main guy will survive, the hero, but a few of the sidekicks might die to progress the good cause. And I think, right, where are we going with all this? And how often are they men and women? So I think it's really important. I think all of this is somehow subliminally affecting how we view our own imperviousness. I'm sure there's a word that says, I won't die. I won't die if I stay protecting the house, because nobody ever does. The hero always lives. I really worry about it.
You and me both, Margaret. I can't agree with you more. Every time I see the Poseidon Adventure or Titanic or something like that, no, don't do that. You're teaching people the wrong thing. Like, Melanie, you want to add to that?
Yeah, I guess picking up on what Margaret was just saying, I think it's pretty rare that one individual film is going to have a kind of a big influence on society, whether positive or negative. But it's kind of those repeated representations that you see again and again across kind of mainstream cinema. And I think it's also interesting to step aside from disaster films specifically. I think it's interesting to think about how films generally impact our perception of different groups of people, because when particular groups of people are represented in particular ways repeatedly, it normalizes and kind of influences the way people think about that group. So historically, women have tended to be represented as weak and vulnerable and lacking leadership qualities and needing a man to come and rescue them, as we've seen through huge chunks of film history in all kinds of types of films, in all kinds of genres. That reinforces social perceptions about women. It gives us the idea generally that women are weak. And although films reflect the society that produced them, films also are pretty effective in influencing society too. And that obviously has a relationship with all films, but I think it is interesting to think about that sort of those repeated tropes you see in disaster movies, exactly like what Margaret was just talking about.
Yeah, exactly. Hyun, do you have a response as well?
Yeah, so just going back to the original question a little bit, though Melanie made some really great points. I think that yes, the depiction of disasters definitely influences how we perceive them and how we would behave in a disaster. I think sometimes audiences might like to underestimate how much influence a film might have over them, because they might separate fiction from reality and say, oh, that's just a dumb Hollywood movie. Of course it's fake. Of course it's not real and I'm not affected by it. But I think there's a reason why films have historically been used as great tools of propaganda. And also all films sort of inherently preach an ideology, whether it's trying to intentionally or not. And I think that's something that we can be in denial about, or recognize and use that for good, rather than getting bogged down in the depressing reality of a lot of Hollywood movies sort of reinforcing quite harmful values and things in film. So yeah, I think I'm always very optimistic about this, and I think these sorts of conversations can be really constructive. And I hope that in all facets of filmmaking, whether it's a disaster movie or a movie about women or Indigenous people or so on, that there's always really robust interdisciplinary discussion and engagement, just to make sure that these stories that we're telling are responsible and impactful in a really positive way.
I couldn't have said it better myself, Hyun. Thank you so much. I think it's about time to wrap up. We'll have this one last question that kind of helps us kind of sum this all up together. It was actually the first question that we got. We've danced around this a lot throughout this discussion, but how do you think the film would be narrated differently had it actually come from the female gaze rather than the male gaze? And I think this is will be the end. Hyun, do you have a response, or anyone else?
I'll jump in. So I saw this question in the Q&A before, and I've been thinking about it. So the male gaze is about objectifying women through the way the camera frames them, the way they don't get to contribute as much to the dialogue. We don't hear them as much. They don't have agency in a story. There's an analogy I really love called the sexy lamp analogy, where you look at a film and consider whether a female character could be replaced with a sexy lamp and the film wouldn't change at all. And it's shocking how many films don't pass that test. The idea of the female gaze has been talked a lot about in film theory and amongst filmmakers, and there's kind of no agreed upon definition of the female gaze. Lots have been proposed, but there isn't kind of an official history of the female gaze in the same way that we can point to individual scholars who've talked about the male gaze and defined what it is. But for me, I think thinking about the Great Flood, I think it might involve giving voice to Anna more. Like, a lot of decisions are made for her. She's actually tricked in multiple points in the film.
Yes.
Giving her agency, like no one ever asks her to decide or give voice to what she wants. She's just told what she has to do and what her responsibility is. So I think allowing her perspective to be voiced more would definitely help.
Yeah, I can't agree with you more. It confuses me a little bit about the kind of secrecy in the beginning. Like, why is there secrecy of this? Why not tell her what she needs to do? As a woman of science, she would be able to get herself there, I'm sure. We're going to have to finish off very quickly, but I'll just touch on with Dr. Cheryl to finish us off, and and then we'll hand over to Bridget to close us off.
I was just going to say that going back to the idea of how this movie would be different, I think we would refer to what Shweta has said a lot about this being collective. We would not just have Anna, but we would have the other women scientists that she worked with, or other people that were in her building, because I'm sure she would know her neighbors more, or there would be that collective network that we saw missing from how people were living in that building. And I think that would be really an important focus of a feminist movie. Would have much more of that idea um, who is involved and engaged, and what are the networks, and we just didn't see that at all in this movie.
Absolutely. What a way to finish us off. Thank you so much, Cheryl. Over to you, Bridget, to take us out.
Thanks, Loriana. So, they say raising a child takes a village, and I think preparing for, responding to, and recovering from a disaster equally takes a village. And so that was a great final note for us to end on.
Yeah.
Thank you so much. So look, thank you everybody for coming along today. This has been absolutely fantastic. I think we're going to have to start a film club or something so we can keep these kind of conversations going. Thank you on behalf of Gender and Disaster Australia and the Australasian Women in Emergencies Network. Jump onto our webpage just to find out a little bit more about who we are and what we do, and get involved. But a huge thank you to our panellists, Dr. Melanie Robson, Dr. Cheryl Anderson, Hyun Lee, Shweta and Margaret Moreton from Gender and Disaster Australia. Thank you so much for coming along and lending us your insights and your wisdom. It's been fantastic. Thank you to all our attendees. Have a great afternoon, everybody, and we will see you next time. Bye.